So welcome everyone. I don't think this person in front of you needs much of an introduction, but if you don't know who this is, it's Dr. Dario Nardi. This is probably the fourth or fifth time I've done an interview with him. I've gone over a lot of his books in the past. Started with Neuroscience of Personality, The Magic Diamond. We talked about 8 Keys to Self-Leadership. My personal favorite book. I think it still is. I think it's still one of my favorites. But then today we're going to talk about his book. It's Decode Your Personality, Go Beyond Myers-Briggs with 64 Brain-Based Subtypes. And really what this book is, if you've read all his other books, is a continuation of it's a continuation of your work with the subtypes and neuroscience, but that you still include some of the tips and tricks and what should I do about my personality that you put in 8 Keys to Self-Leadership. I think a lot of people that have read your stuff will see some of the templates you used before, but it's almost like you just keep building on it. And then, so it's like, do we need to read the other ones? Or is this going to work? Is that all I need to read? So like, do you think that it's accurate to say like, well, you don't need to read my first neuroscience because you kind of get all of it here at the end at your current book? Have you thought about that?
I have actually thought about it, and it's a great question because there are people who gently badger me to make some kind of introductory book. And I'm like, I think already some of them, like 8 Keys, is the introductory book. Like, I don't know how to get more basic than that. I would say that the Decode Your Personality, yes. I mean, with every book, I'm adding on something more. Usually because either the neuroscience research or I learned more by rereading Jung yet again and so on. I think this book comes before, how could I say? It comes before, say, The Magic Diamond, because it's not as complex.
Right.
And people have commented that each chapter, which is clearly like the 16 types. So if a person is just coming from learning about, say, Myers-Briggs or some basic Jung stuff, they have a sense of their type, probably what their type is, then they can just jump to that chapter. And it lays it out with not a lot of theory. So it just has these like chunks and like
Right.
things to pay attention to. I would still say, for folks, like read Neuroscience of Personality because it's probably the most approachable book in just everyday language and even font size and pictures and all of that. I do agree, like 8 Keys to Self-Leadership, I wish more people knew that it really just has a ton of skill building stuff. And, people are like, oh, I want to develop this function in myself or whatever. And then they sort of start on that journey, but they don't know how to do it. And I'm like, there's already a book for that, which gives you like, I don't even know, 2 dozen exercises
Oh
for
yeah.
function. Yeah. Like graded in steps but still flexible. So I would say that's great. Where Decode Your Personality comes in is one, I mean, in a way, it has two meanings. So one is like, okay, you have your type code, but let's unpack that. And the other is actually decode means to like anything is to like not do it.
Right.
Right. Yes. So like let's get past the code
Right.
and look at some of the other stuff that's there. So I just focus on the top 4 functions, as they're called, the stack, and introduce the subtypes, like which is really the heart of the book. And I have to give you thanks because you're the one that kept being like, can't you just make like a PDF stack or something like that I can use?
Yeah.
And that was a great middle step like that, because I've been so busy working with clients, I didn't have time for like a year and a half really afterwards to even look at it. But I knew in my heart, like it's done. Like the body of the work is done. It just needs like clothes and like arms and legs,
Yes.
and it will be ready to go.
Yeah. And I want to tell the audience real quick is the reason I don't have the book to show you is because I've read the ebook so quickly. And when I heard it was coming out, I was like, well, if Dario can't get me a signed one right away for me to read, I'm just going to read the ebook. So I have all my highlights, but I'll post a picture of it so you guys can see. And I will be getting one soon, but that's why I don't have it in front of me because I pretty much all the type canon is behind me and like half of them are Dario. So I will have the book at some point. But continue with what you're saying. Sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. Thank you. I don't want to lead the audience on like a wild goose chase. what will people get out of it? So I would say that they don't need, even though it has the functions in it, they don't need to have a whole lot of type theory knowledge or something. And some folks have commented it like takes them through their type fairly straightforward. And the subtypes is really, it's subtypes, but it means variations, and it's about development. So the whole book is about development, just like
Right.
the Magic Diamond. But this is more development in the everyday, like common sense thought, like, oh, this is the career that I took, and these are the ways that I do my job, and how does my type express itself?
Right.
So there's like Joe the engineer, and there's Joe the psychologist, and then there's Joe the musician, and the Joe the C-suite executive.
Right.
Those are all in you
Right.
somewhere. Yeah, they are. And the question is, but like we have to pick in life,
Right.
and where do we go, and what does that look like?
Yeah, and what's great about this book, there's so many the variations. I know you struggle with it. You struggle. You mention it in the book. You said like, should it be subtypes or should it be facets or should it be variations? And like subtype, you kind of commented on the language. Like even I struggle with like, do I call it subtypes and that sort of thing. So I think all typologists struggle with what the right word is because John Beebe I was always said you got to let the functions breathe a little bit, and I was like, that's a good. I need to remember that. So. Because you list the subtypes, and there's 4 subtypes of each of the 16. You get 64. The dominant, harmonizing, normalizing, and creative. But then, which I like, which I was really glad that you put this in. You actually have a yin yang of each of the functions. So then you kind of break out each of the functions as yin yang, and so you can get each of the functions can manifest differently. For me, just to give you guys an example, is like. I've always struggled with NI in the general description of it being a certain way. And I was like, some days, but the way that you brought it up, but you have the yin side, the yin or yang, we have visionary versus oracle.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, so I see visionary oracle in other people. I think oracle feels more INFJ or like it's oriented towards them that way, but visionary could be INTJ, but I was not wholly one of those. I think I was not the oracle side. I said the visionary side feels more like me, and all the types when they read this book are going to be like, oh, that's the type of NE I reside, I where I sit more in. Sometimes I'm over on that yang side, but my friend is more that way, but still how we can still be the same type. And it clears that up for you alongside the subtype where it's like, my friend's that dominant ESTJ, but I'm a creative ESTJ, and now I can relax because I know my type is still my type, but it's just this creative one, which is kind of where you get the like type that doesn't make sense. You get like a normalizing ENTJ because they don't feel like that's the archetype of the ENTJ. But now that you've explained that, I know I see them in my life. They're not overt about it. What do you want to say about everything I just said?
I think that's right on, and it's even if people don't look at subtypes and they just pay attention to sort of the yin and yang of each function, which is not the language I started out with, but I have to give thanks first to Joyce Meng, because that whole chapter is based on the interview she did of me. And then I just listened to it again and transcribed it, and I'm like, oh, there's good stuff in here, because like I never remember what I say.
Me neither.
Yeah, and then the other was actually the French Personality Type Association. And when I gave a talk to them, and I was like, well, what kind of language should we use, like translating from English to French? And they're like, really, can we just use the yin and yang? That will make so much more sense to our audience. So it is from the French and from Joyce. And for me, it also, it's, I mean, one is actually the third person I have to give credit for is the student who started the process. So I've had interns over the years before COVID. From UCLA, and there was an intern that said, can I just have all of the ENFP data, because she identified as ENFP, and just like sort them different ways by like male and female and like career areas and all of this. And pretty much no matter how we sorted them, there came out 2 pictures. And this picture was either a more, you could see from their career choices. And it isn't always super straightforward. Like if a person does cinematography, is that creative or is that technical?
Right.
And from their point of view, yes, it's creative, but it actually requires a tremendous like technical focus. Like you can't do it without the technical part. Um, and those people actually came out as, I mean, there was a lot of male sort of Yang ENFPs that along with the sort of, as well as like musicians or the whatever it is, it's like, but they took a technical approach to it. So just for them to see, for anybody to see, but it was like staring in front of me the neuroscience data, like seeing their different networks and what is their favorite network. And the way I would describe it is when it shows up in the type, it's one is in the foreground,
Mm,
one is in the background. And that's the only difference. So if you're more of like a Yang-ish INTJ, the yin is still there, it's just in the background. And to a point to what you said, one more thing is that people will be tempted to think, oh, well, the yin goes with the feeling types and the yang goes with the thinking types. And that's so not true. I know from 600 people now in the brain imaging database and from interviews, the relief that comes from, say, a male INTJ, male INFJ, who's like started a tech company and all of this. And he's like, I struggled for a long time. And then he's like, I read the Yang descriptions of things. And it's like, oh, well, that's me.
right.
It's like, I'm not some like airy fairy, tutti fruity kind of like stereotype.
Yeah.
And that's exactly it. And we know an INTJ in common, and she's very much on the yin side of things.
Hmm.
And she's clearly INTJ otherwise. And so that's completely normal. So, like, just as you said, that John said, like, give breathing room to each type and acknowledge the variation. And I think one of the best benefits, I mean, for me, it's like sorting, what's going on with the person,
Right.
like making them choose between two types. Antonia Dodge has said where she found the biggest help was in coaching, because she would see people come in and they might even be unaware of the other side of their own favored functions.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like male ENTP who comes in who's like unaware that there's like a yin side to his own like intuiting and thinking functions.
Okay.
And therefore he comes in as unbalanced, and he comes in as some kind of like no one believes you extreme Barnum and Bailey salesman who's like really rigid about his ideas
Right.
beneath, well, like sounding like he's trying to sell you the moon at the same
Right.
time. And it's like, that's unbalanced. So like, how do we rebalance even inside of our own type?
Right. And I think for me the unawareness was like there's two different types of TE. So there's the builder TE, and I forgot the other one. What's the second?
Like the manager, like the
Manager.
down person versus like the one who's just the perfectionist about like making that clockwork watch.
Right. Right. So that's where I was like, okay, so I would feel more of a TE builder than TE manager. Like I can, and you can see that in different types, and they're not one's not wrong, and I can think of times when I use both. But yes, so the foreground backgrounds. I mean, that helps. One thing I want to switch gears because it's actually one of my first questions I want to ask is, what's the expected pushback going to be from this book?
Gosh, I mean, that asked me to go into some territory I normally don't think that much about.
Well, I'll tell you one. Maybe this will help. I know that people are going to attack EEG machine as a tool that doesn't work in general, and they'll send me and they'll send you, hey, this guy did a study and said EEG is not that great, blah blah blah, and like it's not valid. It sounds like a very logical way. Well, we should attack the machine to discredit personality type. But like, what other things are you expecting people might critique about or push back?
Well, first of all, I'm glad that you mentioned that first thing, because there was somebody on LinkedIn or somewhere who was basically saying that neuroscience is junk science. Like neuroscience is a
Right.
discipline. I'm like, well, you can't really be taken seriously. EEG has been in use for, I mean, practical use, the way it's used today, for over 50 years. I mean, it was discovered 100 years ago. I don't do anything with the EEG that's like weird or different from anybody else in terms of how I interpret the data or represent or whatever it is. All very defensible. I've never gotten any pushback from any actual neuroscience person who uses EEG.
Okay.
One person early on way back when complained about like how I use color to represent things, and she's like, that made me think it was fMRI instead of EEG. I'm like, okay, fair enough. Like that's like a legitimate like little point from like somebody who actually knows what they're talking about. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, part of me is just like, oh, those people just need to be disgruntled so they feel like purpose in life. Um, I think some of it is some of the reason why I say I don't think a lot about it in terms of pushback is because I usually leave a long gestation time, and like send it out to groups of people to look
Right.
at.
You did, and
And,
yeah, you do that. That's good.
yes, and I'm not sending it out to like hostile groups of people. I don't see the point of that, but I do send it out to people who either be like it's starter stuff for them. So are they going to be confused? What kind of questions and ideas did they come up with that help me like frame and present the material, or like walk back some kind of claim, or like change a word that I use? Like I feel like all of that is fair, and that's my audience. And there's always like literally 1 to 2% of the population is psychotic. And so you're always, if you have 100 reviews on Amazon, 1 or 2 of those people just automatically, statistically, will be mentally ill and just like not like what you're doing in a way that doesn't make any sense. So yeah, I don't like that, but that's just sort of the way it is. We're saddled with it. Um, yeah, there's
Okay.
like socionics purists,
Sure.
and I'm like, I don't know. I get the approval of Victor Galenko, who like
Right.
supersedes your opinion about socionics because he's like the actual father of like a lot of this stuff. So, or granddad. So, like,
Right.
let's Victor comment on it instead of you. Um,
Yeah.
I remember one person. She's like, "Oh, it's unnecessary. Like, we can just have bar charts of the 8 functions." And I'm like, then that gets into an issue. Well, one is she was just like coming down from on high in her little like UFO landing, believing she was a queen who had something to say. And I really do try and remain open to stuff, but I'm like, in this case, it doesn't work marketing wise. It's not digestible. As you've said, people don't go around sharing their 5-factor model results because it's cumbersome,
Yeah.
right?
Like
Like
a
a
weird
bar chart.
hexagon.
Yeah, and like your bar chart of stuff like is cumbersome.
Right.
And it also misses a really important point that every person is a whole organism. Like all the parts go together. So when we talk, some people say, "Oh, there's no such thing as a type," and I'm like, walk outside. Like there are types of trees, there are types of animals. Like all the parts need to work together in a way that like supports the organism, the
Right.
psyche. And that's how I see it. Now, could we talk about 8? Could we just call them variations?
Sure.
And I say in neuroscience of personality, I'm like, expect for me to revise some of the stuff as the data comes out. Like that's going to be the way it is. I'm not shy about that.
Right.
Yeah.
And you've got me on this. So I did a bunch of research recently for my second book based on a comment you made, a voice note. We go back and forth on voice chat, and you were saying something about like, well, humans are an organic system, and the brain is part of the organic system of Homo sapien, and within the brain, if we're going to be okay with saying left brain, right brain, if we're going to be okay with that, I'm a left brain thinker, you're a right brain thinker, and there's arguments online about if that's true or not. But if we're going to be okay with saying that, then we have to admit that some people have a certain style of thinking, and then it just kind of all falls apart, and they have to do some mental gymnastics to get back to like attacking you as a person or attacking something else. But um, if we're going to accept certain things about what we say and how we classify people, we're going to have to accept that personality exists. And I think your work is good because it does add that layer of science that is necessary. My son just
There's a little Joe over there. Yeah. Yeah.
I think he's got a lot of he's in that TI phase where he likes to stack and order, and has to be red green red green, and it's a very linear and thought out. So we're not going to cut this. This is going to stay in it. But sorry, he distracted me for a little bit. So can we hold left brain right brain in our head, but also say that personality does not exist?
Well, in generally in neuroscience, it's accepted the two hemispheres are different. So
Right.
there's a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, and they are qualitatively different, like thematically different. Is
Okay.
there such a thing as like a left brain person? Statistically, I would say there are a few people who like come out really biased.
Okay.
For the most part, everybody's using most of their brain,
Right.
even if they're using it badly. And so
And you mentioned like Helen Fisher's her work about hormones and how that affects the brain.
yeah,
It's like
yeah.
there's a lot of work. I think the problem is that and you because you talk about like this work is inspired by these four people and what they did, and it's like
Hmm.
wow. And if you showed this to someone, they'd be like, I didn't even realize it. It's the problem is that you're just not aware of what you don't know. Thus, you only hear like these snippets from the classic people that I always talk about that are big five supporters and they have something else to sell. And you're just like, if you just would listen for 5 seconds, or as my friend would say, if you took one more second to think about it, you'd be like, oh, this kind of has legs to it.
Yeah, it does. It has, like, I have to be honest, like the names of the subtypes are not the names like I gave them. I asked Victor Galenko for permission. A fair amount definitionally as I started trying to explain the results like in everyday language. I went back to Helen Fisher's work. I mean, she's not a nobody.
Right.
She does like real actual like neuroscience measurement. Very good stuff. I think that legs element is very important. And what you're describing is like, in a way, we have all the functions in us, and those sort of difficult people have a lot of Yang TI. So, like a lot of Yang thinking, they're actually listening for how your idea fits into their model and whether it's right or wrong. They don't actually care what you have to say.
Oh, I see.
They're not listening to hear what your model is. They're just listening to see whether the words coming out of your mouth like fit into their model.
Right. That's okay. And it's a very easy person to spot. And I'm not just in life. It's like, oh, like you can't wait for me to make a slip or like to find a reason to shoot it down. And that's unfortunate. I think that's that 1 to 2%, or you're never going to convince them no matter what. So that's not your audience, and it would be such a waste of time for you to and the type community to try to win them over. And I know this book isn't for them to.
Yeah,
It's not the manifesto to be like this is how it is. And
no.
so well, I guess this is kind of a weird question. I wrote it down is why did this book need to be written?
Um, Good question. Some of it comes out of the previous book, The Magic Diamond,
Sure.
that when we want to talk about personality, we need to talk about development.
Right.
Um, Speaking of evidence, so the Minnesota genetics study of identical twins raised apart, which used five-factor model and MBTI and a variety of things, that all of these dimensions, it doesn't matter what model you're using pretty much in personality, are 40 to 60% heritable. You know, they're genetic, which means that 60 to 40% is environment.
Okay.
And I think before people just sort of like, yeah, I'm like this type, and they want to get specific about that. And then beyond that, they're just like, oh, and then there's other developmental stuff. And which is fair, but the idea was to present like a language, and this is coming from Linda Behrens, and
Hmm.
a lever and a lens. So we have a language to talk about the nurture, the nature and nurture, the nurture side of things, and we have a lens to see it when we're interacting with other people.
Right. That's
I
exactly
know a
it.
quiet, invisible child is often like a warning sign of danger. Yes.
Well,
Um,
he's just messing with the router right now, so he,
oh,
you know,
okay.
that
So if 40 to 60% is heritable, that means 60 to 40% is environment. And before we just sort of like waved our hands around and be like, oh, whatever, environment. Um, and the idea was like, no, let's have a language and a lens and a lever to like actually work with that nurture part of it. Because when people, I mean, on the opposite side of the spectrum from skeptics, there are people who are just diehard enthusiasts who are like, oh, type count like explains everything. And that's just nonsense. Also,
right.
um, the yeah, I mean, it's a really great tool to use. It's a way to help us understand, to engage, but to have like this language to talk about what is it that we're seeing and simply be able to say, like, when you're in these different modes, like when you're in a leadership mode, or what is your creative process like, or how do you facilitate, like one-on-one relationships, like when you're talking with somebody, like how do you sit down with them, how do you self-manage to do your best in an organization? Like those are all tapping different sides of ourselves. So
Right.
like let's learn how to ask those questions. And then that's where the lever part comes in, is for the coaching, is to be aware, because so many people, I mean, I had someone who came in, ESTP preferences. He's been working in surprise sales in a large organization for a number of years. He's very unhappy with it. He's like, it's boring. Like it pays decently, but I want to do something else. And just he did the brain imaging, and one thing that really showed up clear is like, well, the basic picture that it shows, the brain wiring, is what's been going on with your brain for the past 2 years. I mean, I don't know with him personally, but like statistically, like it's from 2 years until now, that we can say
Okay.
reliability. And I'm like, and that's in normalizing brain is what you've got. But look in this challenge mode,
Mm-hmm.
which is like the high frequency stuff, the beta waves, the gamma waves, like you show something completely different in that mode. And he said to me, like, I don't feel challenged. So I'm like, if you do challenge yourself, you do the things that you find challenging. This is the kind of person, the subtype that you can become. So just to give people a picture. The third thing is like, oh my God, the biases. Like if there's yet one more ENTJ that's supposed to be exactly this, and if they're not exactly that stereotype, then they
Right.
must like something else completely. So some of the types get a little bit of leeway. Like people are sort of aware there are 2 or 3 versions, but then there are other types. Like poor ESTJ gets maligned all the time. Is there just like there's this one version, and then if you present anything else, they're like, well, then they can't really be an ESTJ.
Right. That's kind of
And I'm
funny.
like, no, there are actually ESTJs, like my grandmother, who was a singer. I mean, what was she like, Kurt Cobain? Absolutely not.
No.
Right. No, not in the least. I mean, loved like all of the old classics, loved entertaining the audience. Is she going to like strip tease? No.
No.
Any of those things? No.
Yeah.
But the point is that, every type in them has a creative side, has leadership potential. Yes, INFPs out there, you have leadership potential. And this is what it looks like. Like read that dominant INFP to see what that looks like.
Yeah.
Even for someone like me, yes, I could work in an organization. I don't like the idea, but I'm aware there's that side of me.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because you can work in an organization, but as a contractor on the outside.
Yeah.
You're not within it, but yeah, and that's what you do. So it works that way. Yeah, that is funny because the INFP is always one that I couldn't relate to very well. But the reason why I believe that my current boss is an INFP, and I wouldn't have believed it if I only had that like MBTI 100 level class under me. I'd be like, no, they're mopey and they're sad, they're not motivated. But I know that he is an INFP, but he's got to be more of a dominant INFP. But you can tell there's certain parts of it that are like that's classic. But as an executive at a big firm, there's a layer that goes over it. Like have to be this way, but like when there's a relaxation and things are under stress, you kind of see the FI really come out. But like having the tools that you've kind of put forth, just how an INFP can address themselves, it helps me to be like, maybe I just need to ask him on a different day.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
It's like, well, maybe this is something that's going to be very personal, or it's going to really clash with like, this is what the company is about. So I need to approach it a little bit differently, but don't be confused. He's an INFP.
Mm-hmm.
Don't try to put another layer on top and then try to say that's what your real type is. So I'm going to go with that. No, but it's funny because I would not have figured it out without this book.
Mm-hmm. And that's really, I'm hoping one of the main applications, yes, is helping people find their best fit. That's a combination of both nature and nurture. And then understanding that even though I use the word subtype because it's easy to digest as a word, and because when I started working on the variant was a term that we didn't need to hear any more of.
No, never.
No.
Oh
Now,
yeah,
and
that's funny.
yet, yeah, and yet that probably is like that technically is a good term. But you know, people can shift over time, and they may even shift into a space they don't want.
Mm.
Like I've heard of this. I mean, I knew somebody, a client, who came back to me wanting a second brain imaging session because he was afraid that the position he'd been in for the last 4 years actually messed him up mentally. And I'm like, and afterwards, I'm like, yeah, I'm sorry, actually, it did. And very quickly, I know within 6 months, but probably the decision internally was made sooner than that. If anything, it just gave him permission to be like, I'm out of here. And he's still in the company, but he moved to a completely different role.
Right.
He went back to his creative self and is happier in that position. So again, it's like showing people not like a finer box, smaller
Right.
box,
Right.
but just more colors in the palette. So we're moving from a palette with 16 colors to a palette that has 64.
That's great. And that reminds me of speaking of, you mentioned Antonia earlier, and the personality hacker is like the zoomed out view, the 10,000 foot view, and it's the same image, but as you get to 1,101 foot away from a person, there's a clearer picture, but it's still the same, but it's a little bit more nuanced, and you get some like you still have the same picture, but it's a little bit better. And I like the idea of having a more crayons to color with. Same picture, just looks a little bit more clear, and you can express a little bit more. So, Dario, what I wanted to ask as the last question is like, where do you want people to get your book? Is it Amazon? Is it, you know you don't do audiobooks. I would love for you to just do one audiobook of yourself. I mean, it is a beast. It is way harder than writing the book. But is Amazon? Where can I get the book?
Yeah. So for those people who do want audio, I understand. What I need to share is that making an audiobook is actually more expensive than the entirety of making the whole book. Like, it is the most expensive service that you can buy to do well.
No, you're gonna do it yourself.
Still, that's a lot of reading. And some of it it's audiobooks are really great for fiction or for essay style nonfiction. But as you know, I tend to lay stuff out graphically because I'm a visual spatial thinker. Not to use like strict categories, but I just like I see it and I feel that helps people learn when they can see it laid out on the page. It's a little bit more challenging to read.
That's true.
Maybe the Teaching Tales book that I could do
Right.
as a video. People can find the book on Amazon. They can find it either as a paperback that they can order, or as an ebook, of course. They can also find it on the Radiance House website if they want like a personalized PDF version, which is a little bit different. Those I think are like the easy ways to do it. And I always ask people, like, if you enjoyed the book, like, please like rate the book, whatever it is, especially when something is new out. And I know as a reader, I go and I look to see like what have other people had to say about the book. Did they like it? Like those kinds of things.
Right.
And I would say besides the sort of the subtypes part, which is there, and the yin and the yang version of each function, that I really tried to put in some other elements that were about what's next. And the part about like with your third and fourth function, which I refer to as like the neurotic boundary, and like your hidden aspirations, energy management, reminders for growth, those kinds of things.
The checklist.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. There's a checklist at the end of each one. There's like the section on energy management, like what are the pitfalls for your type, and like where could you go wrong, and what can you do better with it. I think the hidden aspirations are crucial. I don't spend time explaining Jung's whole alchemy concept, but it's just sort of embedded in there. Like, these are suggestions that tend to like bring out your opposite in a healthy way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really like that checklist part. There's too many things to mention, but the checklist part was actually interesting because it felt like you came up with those completely yourself. I don't know if you did, but it kind of felt like, it wasn't like, oh, I'm taking a little bit of Kiersey and Barron's and BB, but it felt like almost like at least for the INTJ, maybe that's one I think about the most, but there was somewhere it's like, oh, I'm going to tell you, like, personally, this is where I think you need to work on it. And is that true? Where'd you get all the checklist info from?
So a good part of each checklist, 80%, was taken from the quick guide to the 16 personality types in organizations, which I co-authored with Linda Behrens maybe 22 years ago. And those were created very organically. It's literally my usual process where I'm like, okay, it's this type we're going to work on. I get sort of into like this little NI trance state. I put a filter on my brain that says only write positive diplomatic language. And then I just let it come out.
Right.
And returning to that years, like 20 years later, I realized not only was there more supposed to be on the page, but there were some points that could be filled out because 20 years I've learned a little bit more. And so it was good to get those extra points, but it really, a lot of it is organic. It's not me sitting there trying to generate it according to theory or something like that.
What I can tell the audience is he did not use ChatGPT to come up with this checklist. It was actually authentic and real. It's like, oh yeah, only like a person that has dealt with people and interviewed and studied them could come up with this, and that's what I like about it. So, well, Dario, I appreciate the time. Thanks for writing this book. I'm sure you might take a little break, but doubtful. I'm sure you got something else. I know you have some things in the works. We won't spoil it for the audience, but everyone go to Amazon, rate it on Amazon, rate it on Goodreads too. I think even though they're owned by each other, I think Goodreads tends to, I think, be neglected, but you need to post there too, because I think I filter books through that lens because everyone's much more pretentious there. So if you get a good Goodreads review, that means Amazon. If you have a 4 or above, it's 5 stars on Amazon. Then that's why I always try to review there too. So Dario, thanks for the time as always, and I will get this on YouTube as quickly as possible. I'll put all the links in the description so you can get all the canon of Dario's work.
Beautiful. Thank you.
You got it.